Hello, I'm Tracy Christensen. Welcome to Inspiring Lives. Teamwork is an important part of any activity, but when faced with a life and death situation, that cooperative effort becomes essential to the group's very survival. On today's program, we'll hear the story of Joseph Tippett. Lost in the wilderness of Alaska, Joseph Tippett, along with several others, were forced to rely on their skills, their wits, and each other to survive. Though they were constantly rebuffed in their attempts to effect rescue, they continued to believe they would be found. The unyielding faith felt by Joseph Tippett and his companions surely must have come from the countless prayers offered to the Lord, not only by themselves, but by their loved ones back home. Faith, prayer, hope, perseverance, and a reliance on each other and God brought about miracles where there were seemingly none to be found. Please stay tuned for Hearts of Courage, a harrowing survival adventure in the wilds of Alaska.
Welcome once again to Tell Me. As you know, it's our purpose to bring to you those individuals who have a special role to play in our lives and often a special vantage point from which they can look at the world in which we live. Tonight it's a personal pleasure to bring to you the Western Regional Director of the Federal Aviation Agency, who also is a good friend of mine, Mr. Joseph Tippett. We're going to talk about the career and background of Mr. Tippett. Good to have you with us, Joe.
Thank you, Neil. Good to see you.
But if we could begin at the beginning and ask you if you were always pointed in the direction of a career such as the one you've had, or were there other things that interested you earlier in life?
Well, I was born in Idaho, Neil, in Irmo, Idaho, about 90 miles north of Ogden. Spent a good share of
My dad had a unique perspective of life because of an ordeal that he had when he was about 29 years old. That ordeal caused my dad to draw upon the experiences of his ancestors who were in the Mormon Battalion, and it caused my mom also to draw upon her experiences of her ancestors who were in the Willie Martin Handcart Company. This experience was one which taught me about faith, taught me about prayer, taught me about hope, and has been a basis for my testimony and for my understanding of that our Father in heaven, it does answer prayers. The story about my mom and dad has been repeated many times in books, magazines, and in museums. In fact, even to this day, I'm able to share it in firesides with the youth of the church and in talks that I've given. It is a story about survival and about not giving up, and again, that of having hope.
My dad's sister and my mom's brother met and fell in love and got married. And at the family functions, my dad and my mother met.
And so Dad met this girl, Alta Mahoney. He was 3.5 years younger than her, and so there probably wasn't much interest in each other, but he knew who she was and where she was.
Well, when he graduated from high school, it was between the wars and Depression era. He went into the Navy and became a radio operator.
He served on board the USS Saratoga, aircraft carrier of the time, and then he went on board the USS San Francisco, a battleship of the time. He did keep some contact, though, and know of this Alta Mahoney girl that he had met earlier. And so in 1936, he courted and then eloped with my mother. It was not something that thrilled my grandfather Mahoney. A year later, in 1937, they went to the Salt Lake Temple and were sealed.
And upon leaving the the Navy, he worked then for the CAA as a communications operator in Wendover, Utah.
The Civil Aeronautics Administration was established in 1938, and it's the predecessor to the current Federal Aviation Administration. The Civil Aeronautics Administration was responsible for the installation and maintenance of navigational aids. Joseph Tippett was a senior mechanical inspector for the Civil Aeronautics Administration. He traveled through Alaska inspecting facilities for safety.
Once my parents moved to Alaska, they didn't have a home, and so the missionaries in the area built them a home, and that home is still there today. Around this same time, the first branch was organized in Anchorage, and my dad was called to be the branch president. The church in Anchorage was very small at that time, and so the members of the church that lived there all became very close friends, and they depended on each other a lot for support.
Alaska in 1940 was still a very remote part of the U.S. It was a territory, not a state. But in 1940, when they had this opportunity to go, they were with many other people who were going to Alaska to work for either the government agencies or the Defense Department, because there was a certain realization in the country that if there were ever to be a war in the Pacific, Alaska would be a critical defensive position that the Americans would have to defend to protect the mainland here of North America.
In December of 1941, the world was at war. At this time, he was working for the CAA, this Civil Aeronautics Administration. He was located in Anchorage, Alaska, which was on the Pacific front of the war. And it was deemed that his job was crucial to the war effort. So it was important for my dad to work and stay in Alaska at this period of time.
During the war, a lot of soldiers moved up into the Anchorage area, and the members of the ward that were soldiers were all very close, and my mother became a surrogate mother to them, to those men that lived up in Alaska.
The CAA had a lot of activities all over Alaska, installing radio equipment at various airports that were being built for either the Defense Department or for commercial activities. And Dad was involved in installing the radio equipment at several of these airports throughout Alaska. Part of Dad's job was to work with the beacons, or the kind of the highway systems as they existed for aviation in that time, much more primitive than they are today. But these beacons were a way that an airplane would know if it's on course towards a particular airport. And then even if when it went over the beacon, the signal would change so that they would know that they had passed a certain point on the Earth.
Well, of course, aviation was only about 30 years old then. So Alaska was the frontier of aviation then, and I never heard Dad really say why he went to Alaska, but I imagine it was the adventure of going to a place where everything was new, aviation was new, and the bush pilots of Alaska were then, and still are, very important to everything that goes on in much of Alaska. That's the only way in and out of a lot of places is planes. And I would expect that that was part of it, that the CAA said, hey, if you want to grow in your career, go up to Alaska where you're going to be breaking the ground.
Alaskans have been called the flyingest people in the world. And when we remember how big Alaska is, and how much of it is covered with forests and mountains, we can understand why airplanes are the best means of getting from place to place. Large planes have given Alaska a new place in world transportation. Small planes have solved the problem of local transportation, where they can land on small fields or on the countless rivers and lakes in Alaska's backcountry.
And toward Christmas of 1942, tragedy struck. My father's mother became seriously ill in Utah, and it was decided that Dad would travel to Utah to be with his mom during that season, and in fact was gone during the holidays.
He left my mom with a small son who was 1, and she was pregnant with another baby. Those soldiers and the members of the ward helped support her while he was gone on his trip to see his mother before she died.
Dad gets to Utah, spends some time seeing his mother. She recognized him, but she was very, very ill. He did also, though, spend a lot of time visiting with the families of the servicemen who were in his branch. And indeed, in a little book, a little notebook he carried with him, it's interesting to see the names of some of the families and the towns that he was trying to contact. In one case, he got to see the baby of a soldier in his branch. The soldier did not get to see for a couple more years. As Dad was preparing to go back to Alaska, he sat down and wrote to my mother on December 31st. It's a very sweet letter. It's one that I'm very pleased to still have. He says, "Sweetheart, all the mothers think it is just wonderful the way you're looking out for their boys, and they each express their thanks. Alta, I miss you and love you. I thank God for having you as my wife, and needless to say, I haven't been able to get you and Johnny out of my thoughts. Godspeed our quick reunion, and I hope I beat this letter to you." That was not to be the case.
My dad had the opportunity to share this story many times. He wrote it in his journal. Dad recounted what happened during the press conferences. He had interviews. He presented this story in many firesides and to the scouts and to the youth. This story is being told in my dad's own words.
Heading back to Alaska, I made my way from Salt Lake City to Portland, then on to Seattle, and confirmed arrangements to catch a flight north to Anchorage the next day. I would be one of 5 passengers on board a Morrison-Knudsen aircraft. The Morrison-Knudsen Company, based in Boise, Idaho, was a major contractor in Alaska with a number of wartime projects for the Army and the CAA. The particular plane scheduled to fly to Anchorage on January 5, 1943, was a Lockheed Electra 10B, piloted by Morrison-Knudsen chief pilot Harold Gillam.
Aviation in Alaska, indeed aviation generally, was in its infancy. Harold Gillam flourished in this environment. The Alaskan pilots spoke of 3 kinds of weather. There was Pan Am weather, which was clear skies and visibility unlimited. There was pilot's weather, when most people flew. And then there was Harold Gillam weather, in which only Harold Gillam would fly. He was known to his contemporaries as Thrill 'em, Spill 'em, but never kill 'em Gillam. He was widely known among pilots for his reliability in getting through even in the worst conditions.
We were scheduled to depart from Seattle's Boeing Field at 10:30 that Tuesday morning. There was a slight mechanical delay as Gillam's attention was called to an oil leak. The leak was not considered serious. It was temporarily mended by use of friction tape and shellac. Packages, then people, were loaded into the airplane. And as we climbed over Seattle, we watched the downtown office building seem to shrink in size. My fellow passengers that day were Robert Gibo, Morrison-Knudsen's Alaska general contractor, Percy Cutting, a Morrison-Knudsen mechanic, Dewey Metzdorf, the owner of the Anchorage Hotel and Apartments, and Miss Susan Batzer, traveling to Alaska to take a stenographer job with the CAA.
Susan was the prettiest girl in our whole family. And that was pretty common to talk about our pretty girl, Susan.
She decided she wanted to go. And it was an opportunity to work and something new. And so she, with her adventurous spirit, she boarded the plane and she was on her way.
Our first planned stop was to be on Annette Island, 18 miles southwest of Ketchikan. It was the most common fueling and rest stop for flights going in and out of Alaska. We proceeded to the north with relatively clear skies. Visibility was fine as we passed over Alert Bay, but about 5 p.m. we went into the soup, heavy clouds and increasing turbulence. The aircraft's wings began to accumulate ice. We were at war, and Gillam had maintained radio silence, and flying in the clouds, he became increasingly less sure about his distance and direction towards Annette Island. We knew we were 30 to 40 miles out, but we thought we were farther west than was actually the case. Harold Gillam's reputation as not being intimidated by weather was being tested.
Harold Gillam did not have the current charts that were accurate for the beacons to and from Annette. They changed them from time to time in order to confuse the Japanese. In this case, though, it was confusion for Harold Gillam.
Suddenly, the left engine lost power, sputtered, and quit. With the ice and only one engine, we started losing altitude quite fast, perhaps 3,000 or 4,000 feet in just a couple of minutes. Gillam quickly picked up the microphone and called Ketchikan. One engine conked out, expect trouble. Glimpsing mountains through the window, he dropped the mic. He had given no indication of our position. In rough weather and continuing to lose altitude, it was not a question of avoiding a crash. It was now a question of how and where. For 20 lifelong minutes, the plane skimmed treetops and peaks occasionally visible through the overcast. There was almost complete silence in the group, each member of the party mentally preparing himself for the end. The crash was as if we were in an explosion.
The plane crashed into the side of a mountain, but Gillam had done a couple smart things just before the crash. He tried to pancake the plane into the mountain, and although he didn't quite reach the open spot that he expected, he was able to land the airplane on its belly. He also had turned off power to the right engine to lessen the possible consequence of fire. So although the crash was like a severe blow, and Dad described it as being a shock of impact and pain and darkness and noise all at the same time, they did all survive the crash.
The drizzling rain woke me. I called out to the others, but there was no answer. All I could hear was the hissing of the hot engine in the snow. In the darkness, a feeling of panic seized me for the moment, as I thought I was perhaps the only one alive. However, I soon heard a response from Gillam, who, like me, had sustained a head injury.
After this horrible plane crash, they took stock of the injuries. The pilot was in fairly good shape. Mr. Cutting had a hurt back. Metzdorf and Gibo both had broken bones. Susan Batzer had a hand that was almost severed, plus broken legs. My father had head injury, but he was fairly well preserved. And in fact, he was able to, with the pilot's help, to get the survivors out of the plane, but Susan Batzer, they could not remove.
The next day, we cleared out an enclosure under the left wing, and with much effort, we were able to carry or drag Dewey Metzdorf and Bob Gibo up and place them there with some blankets from the plane. I then spent much of the first 2 days inside the plane attending to Miss Batzer. Susan never complained other than with a little humor, asking why I was ripping up her slips and pretty things from her luggage to make bandages.
Dad spent a lot of time talking with Susan. She was conscious pretty much through the whole first 2 days. They talked about Idaho Falls, where her parents presently lived. They talked about the church and Dad's connection with the LDS Church, which Susan seemed to know something about. They talked about her love for her family, but they realized that time was short. The second night, when she was in considerable pain and complained about cold, and coldness particularly in her feet, Dad structured an arrangement where he could sit opposite her and put his feet against her feet to try and give her warmth, because nothing else seemed to be working. Don't know that that helped a lot, but it was an attempt to try and give her some level of comfort. At the end of the second day, late into the evening, she passed away.
I don't think they announced it very loudly, because we didn't get the point. But later on, we did consume it, and we were terribly upset. I remember that part of it.
Alaska in wartime was not a good time for an airplane to go missing. Alaska at that time had a population of only 70,000 people, thinly scattered across a vast frozen terrain. The American military authorities were straining every muscle to develop a chain of military bases to defend Alaska against the Japanese threat, and every resource was devoted to this effort. There was little to spare for the occasional missing aircraft, and there were many missing aircraft during that period.
Scooping out the snow and with a bed of pine boughs, we improved the space under the left wing as much as possible. On the sides, we built snow walls, and with the pine boughs and some seat cushions from the airplane, we had some comfort. With constant rain and snow for the first 4 days, we were pretty unsuccessful in building any fires. When we did start a fire, I put my shoes too close and burned them. From then on, I was entirely without shoes.
My dad had burned his shoes very early on. He put them too close to the fire to dry out and spent most of the 30 days with his feet wrapped in blankets.
When we crashed, they all knew I was the LDS branch president in Anchorage and that I was proud of this. And when I suggested that we have prayer every day as a group, they were all very anxious to do so. However, after 4 or 5 days, Cutting felt any further mention of families and such things as prayer reminded us of our plight and was too depressing. He asked that we not pray vocally anymore. We all followed his request, but I'm sure that these men like me never quit praying. As a matter of fact, I got to where I had a regular trail from the wreck to some rocks where I went to pray, making a pretty good practice of it. And not only did I feel I should, but I knew it would be helpful. One of the things I prayed for most was that my family would know that I had survived the crash and would hold on until being rescued.
It was probably a day or so later when the news of the airplane's loss reached Anchorage. This had to be a great shock to my mother. She not only had me, a young 2-year-old, she was pregnant with a second child that she was expecting. So this kind of emotional turmoil just wasn't something that she was going to be able to handle well. But many people who talked to her, even over the very earliest days, realized that she had a strength and a resolve.
During the time when my father was gone, my mother had a miscarriage and she lost the baby that she was carrying. So even though that she knew that my dad would be alive and safe and come back to her, she did suffer a great loss at losing her baby.
In addition to my scriptures, one book I had with me was Unto the Hills by Richard L. Evans. Unto the Hills was a collection of sermonettes, and over the days we spent camped under the wing of the airplane, I read them to the group. We read the whole book. The philosophies of the different chapters gave us much to talk about, and those conversations were a way to pass the time and to keep our minds in a proper state. Several of the sermonettes spoke in a manner to our current predicament, our dependence on each other, our hopes for rescue, and our prayers for our Heavenly Father's protection and guidance.
With all of its obligations, for good and evil have come before all men, and it is given unto you to judge, that ye may know good from evil. No miracle.
Thinking about the Tabernacle Choir during our difficult circumstances, I often recalled the pioneer song, Come, Come, Ye Saints. Its lyrics calling for determination and courage despite any adversity. The 23rd Psalm was also a comfort.
My shepherd, I shall not want. He maketh me lie down in green pastures. He leadeth me beside the still waters. He restoreth my soul. He leadeth me in the paths of righteousness.
What was your food situation in this circumstance? Obviously, you hadn't planned on crashing. You wouldn't have been carrying much. This must have been a real starvation situation.
Well, our airplanes do and still carry under the Alaska travels emergency rations. We had bouillon cubes and beans and candy bars. And at first, of course, this looked like it would last for several days, which would be enough. But after 8 or 9 days, we were down to wrap 1 billion cube a day in a square of candy from a chocolate bar. And after 2 or 3 weeks, you'd be surprised how much nourishment is in a little square of chocolate.
On the third day, 3 planes, which we heard and then saw to the south, were obviously searching for us. The next day, an Alaska Game Commission plane circled a ridge opposite where we were several times. He flew so close, but below us. He was headed for the coast, apparently assuming that in trouble, we would have tried to get down to a beach to land and look for rescue. It was a good assumption, but of course, we hadn't made it to the beach. We were disappointed, but it was at least encouraging that they were looking for us.
Reconstructing what the searchers must have thought, they concluded that from the time of his transmission and the elapsed time from Seattle, that he must be in the immediate vicinity of Annette Island. So they concentrated their search within a 100-mile radius of Annette Island. Within that radius, they focused primarily on places where he might have landed safely. The searchers were looking for survivors. They weren't necessarily looking for a fatal wreck. So they focused on beaches and flat areas.
The search, though, was hampered by weather. That was probably one of the common problems. And Dad said that even in the first couple of days, as they looked for possible search airplanes, they'd realized that the weather was too severe.
During the 5th day, there was a somewhat encouraging sound, an explosion, which both the pilot and I recognized was likely from the rock quarry on Annette Island. Harold Gillam selected a modest amount of provisions and supplies, including matches, a parachute, and some magnesium flares from the plane. Then he set out to find his way toward the sound of the explosions. He was no stranger to survival in the Alaska wilderness, and based on his experiences, he fully expected to find someone or be discovered and be able to bring rescue to the rest of us. What we didn't realize was how far in that cold air and wilderness silence the sound was carried from the quarry. We never heard from him again. We have no idea what pain and anguish he may have experienced. For the next several days, the remaining 4 of us settled ourselves in, hoping for Gillam's success, but also carefully rationing our very limited food. Our major activities were just collecting wood and keeping up the fire. We heard planes a couple more times. We also were realizing that soon we must get down off the mountain. Our bones might have been healing, but we were gradually not only starving, but also suffering from exposure. I went into the plane one afternoon to search for leftovers from the lunch we'd eaten just before the crash. I got down on the floor of the plane and went through it bit by bit, picking up crumbs of bread, frozen grapes, and disintegrated apples. Given our circumstances, these little pieces of food were really a treat. We didn't have many, but they sweetened our mouths and renewed our spirits just a little. We realized now that staying on the mountain was no longer a viable plan, as we were just gradually freezing and starving to death. So we started preparing for all of us to move our camp down to the valley floor. By day 17, we were ready to make the descent.
Getting down the mountain was an ordeal. It was painful. It was difficult. You talk about Ivo and Metzdorf, both with very badly fractured legs, ribs, collarbone in one case. Those 2 are barely able to crawl. The forest is extremely thick. There's rocks, and of course everything's hidden by snow or fallen tree limbs, and so it's just an extremely difficult descent. And they were trying to bring stuff with them, and they're bringing that stuff in these tarps. And so what you imagine here is they go down a few feet, and then Dad or Cutting, who are the 2 healthy ones, would go back after their goods that they had left a few feet further up the mountain, and then they'd bring the goods down, and then they'd help Jivo and Metzdorf down a little bit further, and then they'd go back and get their goods again. So what might have been a very short distance down the mountain took them basically a day and a half. They get down the mountain the next day, and then they build a campsite at the base of the mountain They gather up as much firewood as they can, build up a water supply around where Jibo and Metzdorf would lay. But they realized that this was not a permanent solution. They were going to have to do something more radical.
That afternoon, I went into the trees in back of our camp and prayed. I had prayed so much that it had got beyond the business of prayer. It seemed to be a matter of talking to God and having an understanding with Him of our needs. I wanted to know what we should do and when we should do it. And I prayed again that my wife would know I was alive.
As I said, when he prayed that my mother would know he was okay, he said he talked to the Lord. And he bears a very strong testimony at the conclusion of his experience when he wrote his own history of it. I think it just heightened his sensitivity to people and to the importance of accomplishing all you can while you've got time. You don't know when our time will end.
Although our new camp at the bottom of the mountain was in some ways an improvement, death by starvation was still our likely fate. Somehow, someone had to try to get to a point where help might be found. After discussion, it was agreed that Percy and I should go, and we reluctantly left the other two men. Dividing the food was easy because there wasn't any. Our thought in starting out for help was that if we could reach the body of water we had seen in the distance to the south, there might be a possibility of walking along the shore until we could reach some sort of habitation. It was a wild hope, but the Lord had given us each a brain and a sound body, and we felt we should give Him a chance to lead us out of our predicament. It took us all day trudging through the valley to get to the shore of the bay. The total distance from the base camp to the water was about 3 miles, but it felt to us as many times that. Nearing the shore that night, we wrapped our arms around each other and huddled together in the single light sleeping bag, realizing we must preserve every bit of our precious body heat. There was little rest. We had to take turns waking each other up to see if the other was still alive. When thought came to me that Cutting might die, I was seized with panic. We needed each other. If one should go, the other would surely die, and likewise the other 2 men we had left behind. Their lives depended on us. This thought helped sustain us in the almost superhuman task of carrying on.
Having made the 3 miles, day and a half, getting out to Weasel Cove as it was, they could see across the water a cabin. And they thought that that might be the next best place to go. They looked at the logs and they started tearing apart some of their blankets to tie multiple logs together to make a small raft. And Cutting continued on over to the cabin across the other side of the cove. When they reached the cabin, Cutting didn't find much. It appeared that the cabin had been abandoned for some time. It was already falling down a little bit, but at least it looked like it could possibly shelter if they were able to use it for that purpose. He did find a few things. He found a can of tar. He found a can of rice, infested a little bit with weevil, but it was a can of rice. And he found a couple other small things. So he gets on his raft again to get back across the water, and he's also towing with him a small boat that he had found near the cabin. As he's trying to get back to Dad, the tide changes, and the wind and the tide between them make it almost impossible for him to get back. And so Dad described the pain and anguish of seeing his companion stranded there in the water, unable to make it towards the shore for a couple hours as they were trying to connect with each other. Finally, Percy Cutting did get close enough that Dad could get out in the water and help pull his friend to shore. But that was an extremely scary circumstance.
Percy and I made our way back to where I had kept a campfire burning. Famished, we cooked the rice and weevils. If you think about it as sort of carbohydrates and proteins, it was a veritable feast. The next morning, we worked to repair the old boat. We used kapok from our sleeping bags mixed with the tar Percy found in order to plug the holes. We became somewhat bold. We felt if we could make our way out to the open water, we could have a chance to get to a net island or find some inhabited place where we could get help. We knew our chances were slim, but desperation and concern for our two comrades back in camp forced us to make a try. Before we left, I had a clear feeling that we should not go. It was more than a feeling, it was a warning. But we set out, and as a result, we were headed for disaster.
Did you ever give up psychologically during that time? That is, you'd be entitled to be, but were you so discouraged at some point you figured this
Well, I guess candidly, once and once only. After some 3 weeks, we had reached the shoreline of an icy bay, and Mr. Cutting and I found a small dory, which had been pretty well eroded over the years of washing around in the ocean. And we finally fixed this up with what few blankets and remaining material we had, and started to the sea, so to speak, out of a bay. And a storm came up, and the boat sank from under us, and we had to swim ashore.
After the boat sank, my father and Mr. Cutting found themselves in the cold water. At this time, my dad couldn't quite understand why they'd gone through this month of just surviving in the wilderness and, almost freezing. And now he's here to, drown. And just at the last moment, he put his feet down and his feet touched the bottom. And his head was just above the water. So these little miracles continue to happen.
This, of course, happened in January. And the weather in that part of Alaska is changeable. When they crashed, it was a snowstorm. They talked about a number of times of heavy snow, but they also had times of melting. So the snow became very heavy and wet in the course of their time. And when they left the two men in the little valley where they took them and went out to the coastline, they talked about trudging through chest-high snow. And of course, being exposed with very little to eat, their body temperatures consequently dropped.
Ordinarily, in these icy conditions, the doctors said we would have been shocked and probably not have survived, but our already starved and somewhat frozen condition, we stood the water better than if we'd have been well and hearty.
As Mr. Cutting and my dad were able to get back up on the shore, they walked along the rocky beach. My dad found his Book of Mormon and scriptures in his journal, wrapped in a waterproof wrap, still in the rowboat, and he was able to take that with him back to camp. This story is one little miracle after another.
Another one, as they make their way towards the north along this shoreline, the Weasel Cove, because of severe cold, had largely frozen over, and they were able to walk across on the ice towards Weasel Point, where the cabin was, probably cutting a mile or two off of what was otherwise an extremely difficult trip.
As Mr. Cutting and my dad made their way back along the shore, I'm positive that they really appreciated these miracles. But in the end, there were still major disappointments.
It had been 12 hours since we left. As we walked back toward the shelter, we saw a Coast Guard cutter circling the bay. Wildly, we ran toward shore, yelling, stumbling, and falling in desperation to get them to see us. The boat went up the canal and right past Weasel Point before disappearing into the fog beyond. Then we did feel discouraged. Had we listened to the promptings not to start out that day, the boat would have picked us up. If we ever had any doubts that we would have been found, it was then. We were not where we should have been, or we would have been rescued. The next couple of days were like a nightmare. We knew we could not go back to our companions. We likely would not make it, and if we did, we would all probably just die there together. All we could do was wait in hopes that another boat would come in and pick us up.
And I think at that point was the only time we really ever became discouraged. The reason I say this is because that night I wrote a note to my wife, which I had not done before, which would lead me to believe that perhaps had reached some despondency.
My darlings, I have been going to write a note to you for 4 weeks, but I have had and do have so much faith that it won't be long until we are together again that I thought it unnecessary. I still do, but in case the unforeseen...
The branch people and the work people got together and decided after a certain amount of time they needed to persuade Alta that Joe was dead and that they needed to leave. So on a given day, they went out to the house to tell Alta it's time to go. The search has been canceled now for 7 weeks and there's no word from them, whatever, you need to return home, take your child. And she said, Joe's okay. He will be found. And the people recorded, we thought Alta was crazy. She had just lost it. And it was within a couple of days of that they found him. So she was right. Dad records that the day of that visit from the church and the work people, he had talked to the Lord, that his prayer was more of a plea than any time he can remember. And that was the day that Mother told the people, he's okay. He'll be found. Don't worry about me.
Obviously, my mother had received a revelation that my father was okay. She never talked about it to me, but I know that she knew in her heart that he was safe and she had faith that he would be saved.
It's now the 28th day. It's been 4 weeks since the crash. Dad had with him a small notebook, which he'd had the names of the soldiers in his branch, and it had been one of his references as he had gone to Salt Lake. It had in it a small poem called Don't Quit, and that probably had been a real reminder to him to bear with the circumstances. One of the lines from Don't Quit: when you want to smile but you have to sigh, when care is pressing you down a bit, rest if you must, but don't quit.
Percy Cutting and I saw the boat about 6 miles up the bay, seemingly anchored. We began a vigil. We lugged driftwood and branches, and we built a pretty good signal fire, hoping for a signal back from the boat, but no signal came. We made excuses for their not seeing our fire. We carried wood until our strength was completely gone.
I've gone to the National Archives in Washington, and I've read the log of this little boat, a 46-foot fishing boat that had been commissioned by the Coast Guard during the war years. And in the log, the skipper writes in his record, "Fire at Weasel Point, probably trappers or hunters." And he goes about his business. He's visiting a couple sites along the bay and along the water, goes down to a far end of the bay, and sets anchor for the night. He doesn't worry about the trappers or hunters. He then records in the log the next morning that he gets up, wakes up the crew, shovels the snow off the boat, gets the cook, and has breakfast. But then he says again, fire at Weasel Point.
A blizzard started up about 4 a.m. We couldn't see a thing. Everything was white with snow. We couldn't see the boat. We didn't know whether it had gone or not. We'd gotten too numb and too weak to keep the fire going, and it began to liquor out. We thought that if the boat had gone, there was no use in having the fire. We turned back into the trees to get out of the bitter wind.
Dad and Cutting had kept the fire going most of the night. And early the next morning, they got back up and relit the fire. They couldn't see where, though, the little boat had gone. This is a boat called the Tucson. They couldn't see it. But if it was still in any distance from them, they hoped to still be seen. The captain writes, see the fire again, probably trappers or hunters, but this time he goes towards it to check it out.
5 minutes later, we were both thinking we were hearing something, but at first neither of us said anything, not wanting to raise false hopes. Our silence, however, didn't last long. and we turned to run back to the shore as fast as we could. We had heard the motors of a boat. We could see it turn in our direction. We shouted and waved frantically. We ran out into the water to meet it. We fell over into the boat almost unconscious.
He gets close, sees these two men frantically waving on the shoreline. The two men run out, Dad grabbing his bundle of papers and documents, but runs out into the water and jump into the little boat. They've been rescued.
After the crash, my grandmother was in a coma, and my aunts never told her about the accident and that Joe was lost. But she would say, Joe needs help. He needs some rope, things like that. And right after he was found, she said, Joe's okay, and died. Within a day or two.
When the Coast Guard brought Cutting and Tippett back to Ketchikan, they immediately began organizing a rescue effort. The Coast Guard cutter McLean was alerted and moved over to the Coast Guard dock and started taking on supplies. Cutting and Tippett were interviewed in the hospital, where, learning that a rescue effort was going to be underway, they rejected the advice of their doctors, and they insisted on rising from their hospital beds and joining the rescue effort to guide the way to their lost friends and comrades.
And then they told him, hey, there's two other men, we've left them behind, they have virtually no provisions, and we can find them. You won't be able to. So they joined the search crew to go back and get the other two men and to lead the Coast Guard crew into the site where they had left the men. And Dad talked about how these Coast Guard people, young men, great shape, etc., were getting sprained ankles and complaining about the terrain and the roughness of everything. And Dad and Cutting, who had just come from 30 days there, were leading them. I think it is remarkable in the sense that they put the safety and rescue of those other two men beyond their own need for medical attention at that point.
I don't know how my mother would have felt about that had he told her that he was going back up the mountain to save those other men. I think that she would have been angry and wanted him to stay in the hospital. Yeah, so that's probably why he didn't tell her.
We found Jibo and Metzdorf lying in thawing snow water, too weak to move from the pine bough bedding and the lean-to canvas covering. They had gotten so weak they could not reach the fire and fuel it with the wood we had left them.
They're alive!
In relief, they broke into tears, as did Cutting and I. We were blubbering, but there was no reason to be embarrassed for doing so. Others wiped tears from their eyes as well. Sadly, during the process of evacuating Jibo and Metzdorf, another search party had discovered the body of Harold Gillam.
During the early afternoon, the crew of the FWS 1901 saw a flash of red on the shoreline, and they put about to investigate. They found the red came from Harold Gillam's red underwear, and they found Harold Gillam dead, wrapped in a parachute, a short distance away. Near his body, the searchers found his shoes set out to dry. There was only a small growth of beard on his face, suggesting that he had died a very few days after he left the rest of the party.
Gillam had apparently died of exposure and shock. He evidently rolled up his parachute covering and went to sleep, never waking. His body was recovered and taken to Fairbanks. Now, only one of our fellow passengers in the crash remained in the mountain wilderness, Susan Batzer's body there in the fuselage of the Lockheed Electra. On February 15th, a group of 6 men set out to retrieve her. Now we had closure for all 6 of us who had been in that ill-fated flight. Susan's body was subsequently returned to the States, and she was buried in Camas, Washington.
My father was a compassionate man, and when he got out of the hospital, he wrote a letter to Susan Batzer's parents explaining the events that took place and how she passed and how brave she was. And I'm sure that that was very consoling to her parents.
It was a terrible shock to them because they were very concerned about her. And because they weren't there. And they had to know. They had to know just what happened. I just remember it was just kind of something that they kind of looked at each other and nodded their heads and said, let's not make it too big.
After some extended time of Ketchikan for recovery, Dad makes his way back to Anchorage. One of my favorite pictures is a picture of Mother and Dad arriving at Merrill Field 2 months after Dad had left to go to see his mother, and she has a most wonderful smile on her face. It is a great picture.
After my dad's rescue, my parents had 3 more children, 2 older brothers, and I'm the baby of the family. My parents lived a very successful life in service to the community and to the church all around the country for another 25 years.
I attribute a lot to the things that I was able to do, and I'm sure the other gentlemen did as much or more. But I was a Boy Scout, and I've been a Boy Scout master, and I've been a Boy Scout commissioner. And many times as a scout, I thought I wasn't getting much out of the program, and many times as a scoutmaster, I thought none of the boys were getting anything out of it.
Yes.
But following this incident, I went back to Ogden, and one of the first things I did was seek out my former scoutmaster, a man named Jesse Draper, who's long since passed away, and I thanked him for the things that he taught me as a scout, which I'm sure he never thought I paid any attention to.
Yes.
So I believe that there's much to be said for youth training and stimulation, motivation, inspiring youth in scout programs and prayer and faith, things of that sort.
I personally went to a number of the firesides where my dad spoke and shared this story. I was very proud to be his son. But more important, I gained a testimony of prayer and faith. I knew that God answered prayers, no matter what. And because I felt that spirit there as my dad shared the story time and time again.
Dad had a real realization that his life had been spared. At a time, many were losing lives. I mean, this is, again, World War II, and many good people lost their lives. And Dad probably made a significant vow to himself he was going to give back in every way he could to God and country for the chance to have this extended life. And he did. He held responsible positions. He continued as the Anchorage branch president until 1947. He subsequently served as a bishop of the Capitol Ward in Washington, D.C. He served in a stake presidency in Washington, D.C. He rose in ranks with the CAA and then subsequently with the FAA. In 1967, his employees from the FAA actually sent in materials to Brigham Young University to nominate him for an honorary doctorate degree. And he was awarded such a doctorate in May of 1967.
When he passed away, he was serving as the associate administrator for personnel and training of the FAA. In the government that put him at the top levels of government civil service. In terms of his relationship with my mother, much of what they talked about in terms of their unity as a couple, I think, was tied to sharing that experience. My mother was ill for the last 15 years of her life, and that was the one event that would always be in her memory of what was important in their marriage and how it affected them as a couple.
Dad passed away in 1968, 25 years after the crash, after his survival, but having given back to God and country in a great way.
More than 60 years after Joseph Tippett was rescued, a visit was made to the crash site. There, the expedition found the remains of the Lockheed Electra airplane. To their amazement, they discovered that over the intervening years, the wreckage had remained in a remarkable state of preservation, very similar to the conditions of 1943. We hope you've enjoyed this story. Please join us next time on Inspiring Lives for another fascinating look into the life of a remarkable person. Thank you for being with us. Good night.